Good evening. I was expecting Josh to give me some abuse, but he didn't give me too much, so I will lay off him. Yeah, do text your questions in to this number at any point during the talk or while Abby is speaking, and what we'll do if we don't like your question is we will just call your number. Then we will know who you are in the middle of everyone else. Out of interest, who's here for the first time this evening? Give me a little wave if you haven't been to anything so far. Great. Well, just for your benefit, to recap, one of the things we've been doing over this series in the evenings is really I'm trying to talk about what Christianity is like from the inside. So the lunchtime talks that Pete has been doing have been really looking at the foundations of the faith and asking some big questions about life and things that lots of people think about to do with truth and relevance and tolerance. And in the evenings, we're really digging into what does it feel like? What is it like to think as a Christian, to live as a Christian? And the image that we've been using over and over again is what is it to come into the home and to wander around the home and see if it makes sense from inside the house. And that's where kind of I want to continue tonight. But tonight, really where I want to try and get to, I'm going to do my best, I might not make it, but where I want to try and get to is to talk about if Christianity is a mountain, for example. It's not about us, at the moment tonight, it's not about us standing back and looking at the mountain and examining it and seeing whether or not we want to climb up it. It's about standing on the top of the mountain and seeing the view from the top. What does the world look like from the perspective of a Christian? And the title tonight is Love Like This Opens the Eyes of the Blind. And what we were saying the other day is that the New Testament, when we look at ourselves and the reflection of the New Testament, it reveals things about ourselves that we maybe don't always like, but that's what it says. So one of the things that it says is that we are spiritually dead inside, and that was a bit depressing when we went through that phase a couple of nights ago. But it was talking about how we're spiritually dead inside, and then when we come to know God, He brings us to life. And another thing that we see in the New Testament as we begin to look at it is that it talks about how we are blind in some sense, that we are spiritually blind perhaps. And again, that maybe isn't the most popular thoughts, but I remember reading a book a little while ago that was telling the story of a man called, that got the name the Elephant Man. And he was born he was around in the 19th century. His real name was John Merrick, and he was born, and there are all these accounts about him. There's been a film that's been made about him as well. But basically, he was born with all these hideous deformities. And in his life, a guy who ran a freak show, a carnival freak show, found this guy, John Merrick, when he was young, and he brought him into his show. And so this guy had to sit in a little cage with a cloak over it on a stool with a little gas burner. And people would pay a couple of coins, and then they would lift up the curtain, and they would see this guy, and they would just go, ugh, because he was so deformed. And one day a doctor went to visit him, and the doctor was working at London Hospital, and he gives this description of this guy, John Merrick. He says, he has a bony mass protruding from his brow, spongy skin with a fissured surface resembling brown cauliflower hanging in folds from his back, a huge misshapen head, the circumference of a man's waist, the nose a dangling lump of skin. His right arm was overgrown to twice its normal size, its fingers stubby and useless. And he goes on like that. This guy looked horrific. And his story was that he travelled around in this carnival, eventually ended up in Belgium, and the carnival got closed down. And the guy that owned it stuck him on a boat, sent him back to England with no money. And he found himself picked up by the police in London. And the one person he had to contact was this card that he kept in his pocket for 2 years, which was the card of the doctor that wrote that description. So he gave him that, and the doctor came and picked him up and took him to the hospital. He hadn't eaten since he left Belgium. When he arrived at the hospital, the doctor ordered some food for him, and the nurse who brought the food walked into the room, saw this guy, John Merrick, screamed, dropped the food all over the floor, and ran. And he barely flinched because he was so used to people reacting to him like that. And all psychology says that he, because of the way he'd been treated, should have really been like an animal in his mannerisms and his behaviour. And what the doctor says is the more that he got to know him, the more that he discovered, he actually was incredibly literate. And he'd actually spent a huge amount of time reading the Bible and reading Shakespeare and reading Jane Austen, which was in vogue at the time. And he was an incredibly kind and gentle person. And one of the things that this doctor discovered was beneath this hideous exterior that people were revolted by, there was this incredibly kind and gentle soul. One of the things about that story that's so powerful is it speaks to me about the fact that if I was there, I would have reacted the same way everyone else did. Ugh. Because I judge too often by what's on the surface. What the New Testament teaches us and what it suggests to us is that maybe instead of simply judging everything that we see by what's on the surface, we could maybe pause and consider whether or not there might be another dimension going on, whether there might be something underneath the surface of everything that's going on. And for Christians, the way that we view the world, it involves this thing called faith. And faith is described and defined in lots of ways in the Bible. One of the things it's described as is an assurance of things not seen. And to come into a place where we believe something on the basis of faith is sometimes a difficult journey. And one of the questions that we of course would have is, well, how do you know if it's true? If you're going to start to trust things that you can't see, how do you know whether you can really trust them? And just in terms of viewing the world, there's a number of ways in which I think you can decide whether or not you're going to trust something. If something is a piece of a jigsaw, you decide whether or not it's going to fit. And C.S. Lewis, at the start of his book Miracles, he uses an example where he talks about, if you imagine finding a novel, and you find this novel, and you read it, it kind of sort of makes sense, but it doesn't make that much sense. And then years later, you find a chapter just lying in a drawer somewhere. And you get that chapter out. How would you decide whether or not that chapter was authentically part of the real novel, whether it was authentically part of it? The way that you would decide is you might do some sort of forensic testing, look at the language, look at the grammar, see if it all matches. But really what you would do is you would fit it into the story. And then you would read the novel again with this chapter inserted in, and you would see if the chapter made the plot clearer. You would see if the chapter enriched the wider plot, and whether it brought different dimensions out. What we have found is that Christianity and the gospel, when we fit it into life and the world that we live in, it makes sense of everything else. And so what we do is, in view of the gospel, we begin to see everything through those lenses. Like a little bit like when you go to the cinema and you've got those 3D glasses on. Before it, everything's a little bit blurry, and then you put them on, and there's this whole other dimension that comes out. And the reason we've been talking from the Bible every night is because we believe that this is a book that God inspired, and that there's God-inspired truth running all the way through it. And again, that's a big claim to make, and we've talked at different points about the historical reliability of the Bible and things like that, but one of the reasons I trust it, I think about it a little bit like, I talked about my stag do before, and how because we're Christians we can't go and get hammered, so we have to do other things for fun. And one of the things that we did on my stag party, it was a stag weekend, is I lived up in Sheffield at the time, and we got put into, me and all the other guys, we got split up into 2 cars in the middle of the night and driven off into the moors outside of Sheffield and just dropped different locations in the moors. And it was a race to see who could get back to the house first, who could get back there by breakfast. My team won, I just want to say that, but that's because the other team went to the pub. And I was like super competitive, like, come on! Anyway, so we had this race, and one of the things that happens is when you get dropped off there, you've got your map, haven't you? That's all we have, we just had a map. And in that place, you have to figure out, can I trust this map? So what do you do if you're trying to figure out how to trust the map? What you do is you look at the landscape around, and you think, okay, I see a tree, I see a hill, I see a river. Then you look at the map, and you see, does this landscape seem to match? And you think, okay, I see a tree, I see a hill, I see a river. And then you think, okay, I'm at point A, and I'm trying to get to point B. So you start to walk. And as we're walking along, there comes a point where there's a fork in the path. And the map seems to indicate that if you want to get to point B, you should be going this way. But our man instincts, which of course men know are never wrong, seem to indicate that we should be going that way. And so we decide, what should we do? My man instincts are telling me to go this way, but the map seems to be saying go this way. Well, it matches the landscape. Okay, I'll go that way. So you start walking that way, you walk a bit further, you see, and you think, oh my word, I'm glad I didn't go that way. I would have fallen off a cliff. And you carry on walking. And what happens is ultimately you trust the map the closer and closer you find yourself to getting to point B. And as human beings, is it not the case that we are all at point A? A point where we're looking for certain things. We're looking for freedom, we're looking for love, we're looking for truth, we're looking for purpose, we're looking for meaning. We're all following a map of some kind. What I have found as I've followed the map of the Bible is I've found that I'm getting closer and closer to point B. What I found when I don't follow it is I end up falling off cliffs that I regret. And what the Bible points us to more than anything is not a place, point B, but as we've said over and over and over, person, Jesus, and relationship with him. And to quote Lewis again, he says, "I believe in Christianity like I believe that the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." What is it to see everything by Jesus, through the eyes of Jesus? If you have your gospel with you, you can have it on your chair. When you open with me, it's on page 26. Oh, sorry, actually, we're going to be on page 28. And this is Mark chapter 10. You can feel free to take these Gospels with you when you leave and have a little read of some of the other stories about Jesus. But in Mark chapter 10, verse 46, there's a story that I'm going to be talking about a little bit. And it says this: "Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, which means son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, 'Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me.' Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' So Jesus stopped and said, 'Call him.' So they called to the blind man, 'Cheer up, on your feet, he is calling you.' Throwing his cloak aside, he jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. 'What do you want me to do for you?' Jesus asked him. The blind man said, 'Rabbi, I want to see.' 'Go,' said Jesus, 'your faith has healed you.' Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road." So there's a number of things we can draw out from this story. The first one is it strikes me that Bartimaeus already had some sort of hope in Jesus before he seems to have met him. And the reason we can tell that is because the moment he hears Jesus of Nazareth is walking past, he starts shouting his head off, "Jesus, Jesus, come on." And people tell him to shut up and he shouts all the louder. How has he come to that place of being so interested in Jesus? I think the only way, and this is speculation, but as far as I can tell, the only way that he could have come to that place surely is just by hearing stories. You know, he's a blind beggar. He wouldn't have travelled around Israel. He would have sat in that place probably day after day after day. But as he sat there by the roadside, he would have begun to hear the rumours about this guy Jesus. He would have heard a rumour that Jesus was curing people of leprosy. He would have heard a rumour that Jesus had raised the guy from the dead. I can only imagine what it must have been like for him when he heard a story about Jesus healing someone born blind elsewhere. For a blind guy with no hope, that would have been like a drink to a thirsty guy in the desert. "Tell me that story again," he would have said to people that walked past. Because he heard stories, he started to trust this guy Jesus. How many stories about him have you heard so far? How many have we talked about day after day during this mission? How many stories have you heard from different people around? Is that enough to begin to wonder maybe whether there's some truth in it, maybe whether it's worth calling out, seeing if he'll come nearer? Bartimaeus heard, so he began to cry out. And then the second thing that I find really interesting about this is when he comes to Jesus, he kind of, eventually they bring him to him. And then there's this bit in verse 51 where Jesus asks this guy who's blind, so it's pretty obvious what he's wanting from Jesus, who had a reputation as a healer. But Jesus asks him anyway, he says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And then it says, the blind man said, "Rabbi, I want to see." Part of seeing with eyes of faith, part of what that involves is wanting to and choosing to. And sometimes the reason that is hard is because our sense of self is so tied up with our current positions. Pete talked about it when he was talking about truth. None of us come from neutral positions with a worldview. We always have entrenchments. And so if we're going to make a shift, a paradigm shift, that can be a really hard thing. And I remember when I was dating my wife Beth, my now wife Beth, she went to university in Bath, and I was trying to pull the moves on her like crazy for quite a while. And if you were to speak to me, partway through Beth and I dating, and you were saying, "How's it going, Andy?" I would definitely tell you, "Oh, you know what, it's going great. I am totally charming her. I took her to Shake Away." And all these other things I paid. And anyway, and I remember this one time I went to visit Beth in Bath, and she was particularly cold one evening when we were walking along. So we do the thing that guys do, which is, would you like my jumper? And she says yes, so she put my jumper on. And I remember just before I went back to Cambridge, I said to her, oh, can I have my jumper back? And so she gave it back to me, shoved it in my bag, and then shoved it in the wardrobe when I got home. And then I remember 2 weeks later, when I was at university, getting this jumper out of the wardrobe, and it just really smelled, in a good way, of Beth. Like, it really smelled. I was like, whoa, that is crazy. And that was 2 weeks ago, and I remember putting it on and thinking, wow. And so I spent like 2 days just sort of walking around Cambridge, just sniffing the hood of my jumper as I was walking. And I remember talking to her on the phone and saying, you know, Beth, this jumper, I know this sounds weird, but this jumper just really smells of your perfume. And she was like, oh, does it? And I said, yeah, all right, okay. And anyway, I didn't think anything else of it. And then about 6 months after that, when we were pretty serious, she confessed that what had happened is, before she gave my jumper back to me, she'd taken her perfume and she'd literally poured half a bottle of the jumper. Just giving it back to me. And then it cracks me up about that story. It's like, when I spoke to her, and I said, Beth, this jumper really smells of you. She was like, oh, does it? Oh, does it? Oh, that's fine. And you see, I used to think, right, the way that it was working with Beth and Andy is I used to think that I was pulling the moves on her. Now, I see that I was like this innocent little fly. And she was spinning her web of life, and I didn't have a chance. I was caught. And there was like that in a way is a totally other way of looking at something, isn't it? It's a total paradigm shift. It was a little bit of a blow to my manhood when I realised that was what was going on. But that was what was going on. And in the same way, what can happen is, for us, we all have positions from which we view things. To shift and to change that is a hard thing. It's a difficult, it's a painful thing sometimes. It's a scary thing as well. Do you see what it says? It doesn't say, in verse 56, it doesn't say Bartimaeus said, Rabbi, I want to see. It says the blind man said, Rabbi, I want to see. He was all about being blind at that point. And then suddenly, he said, I want to have my eyes open. When we come to know Jesus, there is a choice. It's not about wishful thinking. I believe this is true with all of my heart, that it matches up with the fabric of reality. And yet at the same time, it's how we began the week is this sense of coming with a degree of honesty and a sense of willingness and a wanting to be open. And then what happens is, when his eyes are open, do you see what happens in the next verse, 52? It says, Jesus says, go, your faith has healed you. And then it says, immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. So he goes from not seeing to what would be the first thing that he saw? Jesus' face. The first thing he saw would be Jesus' face. And then he goes from there to walking along a road with Jesus, seeing everything from his perspective. This is what it's like inside the house. You come to know him, the first thing you see is Jesus. And then what happens is we begin to see everything through the lenses of Jesus. What it's like to be next to him on the road. We see everything from that perspective. And in that sense, we begin to love the things that God loves. And I don't know if you've ever hung out with someone who's particularly passionate about something, but I have a friend of mine, he loves food, he just really is into food. And I spent a gap year with him, traveling around the world, helping him out. And I'd never been in a restaurant with anyone quite like this guy. He would just order ridiculous quantities of food, and then he would just bang on about how amazing all the food was. So we'd be sitting there, and he'd just be like, oh my word, Andy, these olives are the best olives I've ever had in my life. And he would be like, Andy, can I just stop you? This lasagna is like a piece of heaven. And he would just go on and on and on and on and on. I was like, all right, I get it, you like food. And I remember going to university after that, and before that, I never really cared about food, to be perfectly honest, that much. And then obviously at uni, you go to different restaurants, so I find myself frequently in McDonald's. And I would be there with my friend Johnny, and I found myself sitting there with Johnny. I'm like, Johnny, can I just stop you there? The cheese and the burger. I don't know what it is, but it just seems to work. And I found myself suddenly getting so into food. I realised that I caught something of my mate's guy called Mike. I realised I caught something of his passion just by being around him. That happens around people who are charismatic. It happens around people who are passionate. How much more does it happen around God? How much more does it happen around Jesus? When we spend time looking at him, We begin to see the world as he sees it. We begin to care about the things that he cares about. We begin to love the things that he loves. What does God love? If God reveals himself to us, what are the things that he loves? Let me tell you what God loves. One of the things that he loves in the Old Testament, right? This is the thing that he talks about second most. The thing he talks about number one is love me first. I come before everything. That's the first thing. But the thing he talks about second is the poor. It's the poor and the broken and the marginalised and the dispossessed. The second most common topic in the map of the Bible, of the Old Testament, is you have to manage your possessions in light of the poor. The New Testament is no different. Let me just talk about quantity of verses for a moment. In the New Testament, 300 verses have direct teaching on loving and serving the poor. That's 1 in every 16. If we take the Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, it's 1 in every 12. If you take Luke by itself, it's 1 in every 10. If you take the letter of James, it's 1 in every 7. There is more direct teaching in the New Testament about loving the poor than there is about sexual morality, than there is about prayer, than there is about heaven and hell. And that's not because God doesn't care about those topics, it's because he cares about the poor a lot. And that's quantity. Let me talk to you about quality just for a moment. Because in Isaiah, the people of Israel, what they're doing is they're worshipping God, but they're worshipping him in a way that isn't really in line with his heart for the poor. And so they're doing all this stuff like they're fasting, which is part of their worship, and then they're praying, which is part of their worship, but they're kind of not really seeing answers from God. And then they come to God and they're sort of like, well, why aren't you hearing us? Why aren't you answering us? And then through the prophet Isaiah, God thunders and answers back at them. And these are the words from Isaiah 58. He says, "Is not this the kind of fasting that I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not turn away from your own flesh and blood, then your light will break forth like the dawn." I've read some words there. That's the heart of the God of the Bible. It's a heart that we see so clearly revealed to us in Jesus Christ. And in Matthew 25, Jesus paints this picture, this story, this parable about the end of time when everyone gathers before him. And he says that there's going to come a point where we stand before him and we are judged before him. And one of the things that he will say to the people that he welcomes at that point is he'll say, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you visited me." Where does this argument that I'm making that's what God's like and that's how we see the world fall down, where does this argument fall down? You've probably already responded to it, haven't you? The church. And the fact that we are a bit of a mess and that we are bigoted and prejudiced and broken. And we do a whole load of stuff that is wrong. It falls down when we look at the church sometimes. And also, what I'm saying, please hear me, is I'm not suggesting for a moment, an instant, that Christians are the only people who do good things. That Christians are the only people who love the poor and the broken. There are people all over the world, from every faith and no faith, who do that. I understand that. But what I am saying is to love God, this is not an optional extra. Christians, the church, when we become Christians, we don't suddenly become perfect. We're broken and we're weak. That's why we said on the second night, to be a Christian, first and foremost, is to admit weakness and brokenness before God, to admit that we haven't got it right, that we've made mistakes. And yet, to come to know Jesus is to love him and then love the world like he loves, to love like him. And although the church is imperfect, I have had the joy of travelling all over the place and meeting the church in different locations, and I've seen it too many times. When people encounter Jesus, they do get reorientated. They do get changed. I could tell you about all sorts of people. I've got friends, Titch and Joan, they're called. They live in South Africa. Titch is a cricket player, or he was. He used to be a cricket player. He played for South Africa, wicket-keeper. And him and his wife, Joan, they were very rich and successful, as you can imagine. And then Titch became a Christian. He met Jesus, he became a Christian. His wife Joan also became a Christian. And what's happened for them in their life is they're now kind of in their old age. And a couple of years ago, 8 years ago actually, Titch and Joan discovered, well, I don't know how they didn't know this, but they just lived in a bubble really, but they found out that there was a shanty town just down the road with all sorts of poor people living in just desperate poverty. So Joan started to make peanut butter sandwiches, and she went down to the shanty town and she would give them out. And what they do is really grown from there. They're at a stage in their life now where they really should be settling into retirement, living very comfortably. Do you know what they've done? They sold their really posh house, and they're building a children's village, and they're filling it with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of AIDS orphans. They're there now. I'm going to go and visit them in April. And that's what they're doing, because they met Jesus. Their life became reorientated. It became changed. To be a Christian is not to be a good person, it's to be a forgiven person. Nor is it to be an improved version of ourselves. It's not about being a better version of us. It's to die to ourselves and to be born again. And that does lead to radical transformation. I could tell you about this little church that I found in Malaysia, a place called Ipoh, this town in northern Malaysia. And there's this little community of believers there. And for the last little while, they've been running this children's home. For 20 years, they've been running it. And I've met some of the kids at the children's home. There's a guy called Moses. He's 19 years old now. They found him. The pastor was telling us as we were walking around. They found Moses on a rubbish dump in this place, Ipoh. He'd been abandoned by his parents. They never found his parents. And he was acting like an animal. He was acting like a dog. He couldn't speak. He had nothing. And they took him and they cared for him. And what happened is they looked after him and they educated him. When I met Moses, by the time I met him, he was a part-time musician. He'd been educated. His goal in life was to become an airline pilot, and he'd already started studying aeronautical engineering and flown a plane for the first time. Because there was that little community of believers trying to love the world as God does. There are others. There's this church in a place called Espírito Santo in Brazil, shanty town. Friends of mine from my church went recently. When they arrived, in the last 20 days, there had been 35 murders in this place because of the drug wars that are going on. They wandered around with some of the people from the church, and everyone was greeting them because the church are there all the time. They're a presence there all the time. And as they wandered in, they went to this place where they saw this guy who he used to be a drug lord in the shanty town. He used to be one of the sort of guys that headed up a drug cartel. And they chatted to him, and they found out that this guy had since become a Christian. Recently, he'd met Jesus. He said to them, I decided I'm going to stop killing people now, which is a good thing. And instead of killing people, I want to serve them. I want to serve them. That's what happened. Now, he was in danger because the drug cartel were now trying to kill him because he wasn't with them anymore. So the church was trying to raise money to get him and his family relocated. But he said, I want to serve people now. I don't want to stop killing them. That's what happens when we have a real encounter with the living Jesus, because these are the things that he is passionate about. These are the things that God is passionate about. And when Bartimaeus' eyes were opened, he saw Jesus Christ. And then he walked along the road and he saw the world as Jesus sees it. For us, what is it to look through the eyes of Jesus Christ at the world? It's to look at the world with love, look at the world with compassion, look at it with hot-blooded courage, a determination to punch holes in the darkness until the light bleeds through. It's to look at the world and try and bring a change, and try and bring a sense of justice, and try and bring a sense of freedom. Do we do that very well? No, we fail at it often, but that's the aspiration because of who we have encountered. And I just want to ask the question, don't you kind of think that life is meant to be more than just about us? Don't you think on some level that it is? To live for something bigger, to die for something greater, to spend yourself for something that is worthy of effort and pain and cost. I think you do. And there's this account in Lord of the Rings, I'm coming into now, but in Lord of the Rings, Aragorn is talking to Eowyn, and he's like, you haven't seen Lord of the Rings, he's this big guy with a sword, and she's a woman who wants to have a sword, and they're having this talk about whether or not she can come with him to battle. She wants to go off to battle, and he's saying, well, I don't think it's a very good idea, you need to stay behind and kind of look after the people here. And there's this exchange, and she says to him, after he's tried to persuade her to stay behind, she says to him, "All your words are but to say, you are a woman, and your part is in the house. But when the men have died in battle and honour, you have leave to be burned in the house, for the men will need it no more. But I am of the house of Ale, and not a serving woman. I can ride and wield a blade, and I do not fear either pain or death." And then he says, "What do you fear, lady?" "A cage," she said, "to stay behind bars until use and old age accept them, and all chance of doing great deeds is gone beyond recall or desire. What do you fear?" "I fear a cage. I fear staying in this place where I am until any chance of doing great deeds has gone beyond recall or desire." I want to suggest that unless we see the world through the lenses of Jesus Christ, we are in a cage. Whether it's a cage of wanting to live for a comfortable life or wanting to live for other good things, I want to suggest that maybe we've missed something, and that seeing through his eyes brings a change and brings a freedom, and that freedom from the cage comes from losing your life for him and for his gospel. I have to say this stuff because it's what's in the book. The way that God reveals himself to us is a God who loves passionately the poor and the broken. I want to finish with one story. True story from South Africa. After Nelson Mandela got let out of jail and became the president, he set up something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the purpose of it was to stop everybody killing each other. Because what happens is when one tribe gets power, they want to take revenge on everyone else who's done things to them. So the way that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission worked was that white South African policemen or people who'd been in the army could come, and provided that they confessed all of their crimes, they would be let off without any punishment. And so there's this one scene in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission where there's this elderly black lady who is on one side of the room. The courtroom is full of people, and there's a white South African policeman called Mr. Vanderbroek, who's at one side in the witness dock. And Mr. Vanderbroek is talking about the things that he did to this lady's family under apartheid. And he talks about how one of the things that he did is he with some other police officers, they shot this lady's son, and they took him away and they burned him on a fire, turning him like a piece of meat on a barbecue to destroy the evidence. 8 years later, he says, they came back to this woman's house, and this time they took her husband and they made her watch while they tied him to a wood pile, and they poured gasoline all over his body, and they burnt him to death. And he says that as he's sitting there in the dock. And the judge turns to this elderly lady, and he says to her, "What do you want from Mr. Vanderbroek?" This lady looks at him across the room. She says, "I would like 3 things from Mr. Vanderbroek. First, I would like him to take me to the place where he burnt my husband's body, so that we can gather up the dust and give him a proper burial. Second," she says, "Mr. Vanderbroek has taken from me my husband and my son, but I still have a lot of love to give. And so I would like for him to visit me twice a month in the ghetto, to spend a day with me, so that I might be a mother to him. And third," says this old lady, as she gets to her feet, "I would like to embrace Mr. Vanderbroek, so that he would know that I forgive him and that God forgives him." And then she got up and she hobbled across the room. And as she did so, the crowd around spontaneously began to sing the words to probably the most famous Christian hymn ever written. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see." At that point, Mr. Vandenbroek fainted. So, what I'm saying is that we judge Christianity on one level by whether it makes sense of the world, whether when we look at it through the lenses of Christianity, things seem to grow in their richness, in their truth, and in their meaning. Could it be that when we see it through these lenses, through the lenses of Jesus Christ, we see more clearly than we have ever done? I want to suggest that it could. I don't feel like I've said what I've said very well, but hey, I run out of time now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say a prayer, and if you're here and you want to give your life to Jesus, so that thing that Bartimaeus said, Rabbi, I want to see, you want to give yourself to him. This is an opportunity for you to do that. Obviously, don't feel any pressure at all. If you want to come back tomorrow, we'd love to see you. But why don't we just bow our heads just for a moment? And if you want to give your life to Jesus in this moment, this is kind of a big deal, to understate it. And I'll say a prayer, and then you just pray this after me in your heart. Lord Jesus, I thank you for what I've heard about who you are tonight. And I thank you for the message of your gospel, that you loved me when I was far away from you. And right now, in this moment, I say, I want to see. I want to trust you. I want to come into your kingdom. I want to be part of your mission. I thank you for the cross, which has made that possible and has set me free. And right now, here in this room in Oxford, I give my life to you. Now and forevermore. Use me to change the world. Amen. Amen. Open your eyes. If you said that prayer, one of the things that we would love to do is just support you. So there's a little card, like a response card. It's got a little box in there that says, I want to follow Jesus. If you want to follow Jesus and you prayed that prayer, tick that box. Someone will be in touch with you just so that we can get to know you and help you go for it and live for Jesus. Thanks very much. Over to you, Josh.
Thank you, Andy. We're just about to hear from Abby, who's going to talk about how she came to know Jesus for herself and how that's changed her. While that's going on, do text in any questions you have to the number, and afterwards you'll have a chance to hear some of the responses. So can we welcome Abby to the stage?
Hello everyone, so I'm Abby. I'm a freshman here at Worcester College. I'm studying for a maths degree. And I'm just going to share with you, what Jesus has done in my life. So I was brought up in a Christian family, which means that Jesus has always been kind of around in my life. The idea of the Christian God was familiar to me. Like, I was dragged along to church, I went to a Christian primary school, and I just went along with it all really. I suppose I thought I had the whole Christian thing down pretty well. It didn't seem at all odd to me that God, the creator of the universe, would love me. Like, why wouldn't he? I knew all the answers at Sunday school. I could tell you that Jesus was God in human form. He came down to earth, died on a cross because I was mean to my brothers and I told lies. And then 3 days later he came back to life. That was all just pretty everyday stuff to me. But then I got to like year 6, so that's when you're 11. And I realised that it was slightly abnormal to believe this stuff. I knew that a lot of the world didn't. And I began to question, could this really be true? How on earth could we know that Jesus really existed? It all happened 2,000 years ago. The Bible probably hadn't got it right. And I think I decided that everyone at church and my parents and my family, they'd all been taken in by this big deception. But I didn't give up on Christianity altogether for a couple of reasons. So the first was that the Christians I knew were making huge life-changing decisions based on what they believed, and they didn't seem particularly unintelligent. And then I was really curious about the fact that they loved me. I did think I was pretty great, but I still knew that 11 to 14-year-olds weren't the most fun age group for adults to hang around with, and yet loads of these adults wanted to spend time with me, they invested in me, and they genuinely loved me. So I went on a Christian camp that summer, and I grilled all the leaders about why they thought the Bible was true. And I was surprised to find they often had really good answers, or if they didn't, they could point me to books that had really good answers. So over the next year, I learned that what the Bible was saying was true. The Gospels were historically reliable, but it was more than that as well. I began to realise that Jesus hadn't come because I was mean to my brothers and I told lies. But actually I had a big problem with God. The way I was living completely rejected God, His love and His authority. I was just looking out for myself. So God was showing me that I needed Jesus to take my place. And then when I was 11 or 12, I don't know when exactly, but I decided to accept what Jesus had done and that I wanted to follow Him. So things didn't change for me overnight, and I didn't suddenly become a perfect human being who lived for God flawlessly every day. But my life did begin to change, and it's been really exciting. And I think it's important to point out that my questions about the Bible didn't stop. I liked to think when I was 11, and I still like to think now that I'm 19. The Bible, I had loads of questions about it, and I still do. But most of the time, if I pray and I ask lots of people and I look hard enough, God provides me with an answer. And I'm just going to share with you quickly 2 ways that God's been changing my life over the past year or so. So, as you probably know, coming to Oxford's a really massive thing. And since October, I've been learning just how weak I am and how strong God is, and also how little I rely on God. So before I came to Oxford, I knew I wasn't perfect. I had a lot of things going on inside that were pretty bad. So pride, lust, lack of love for other people, general selfishness. But if you'd have asked me, I would have said that I was relying on God. He was providing my security and my identity. And then I came to Oxford, and suddenly I was in a place where my friends and my family were far away. I wasn't clever anymore, I could barely do the work, I didn't get enough sleep. I was surrounded by confident people when I used to be the confident one. In the first week of term, I got a cold with an eye infection, so I looked pretty ugly. Actually, it was really tough. It hit me really hard because, without realising it, I'd been putting my faith in all of those things, and suddenly they'd been taken away. And I found last time really difficult. I came home feeling really confused, like why had God let this happen to me? It was too tough, and to be honest, I just felt pretty broken. But God was showing me that I wasn't the amazing person I thought I was. I'd been thinking I could do things in my own strength, and actually I needed to be relying on Him. It was always going to end badly if I didn't. But also, God wasn't distant from me when I was feeling down. So at Christmas we celebrate the fact that Jesus came down into this world full of broken people to save those broken people. And that's what I was. And now it does seem crazy to me that God would love me, because I'm pretty ugly on the inside. But that's who Jesus came to die on a cross for. And it also seems crazy that God would choose to use someone like me. But now I know that when He does, it's not so that I can boast in my own strength, but I can only boast in how mighty God is. And the second thing that God's been massively doing in my life lately is changing what I live for. So I used to want a comfortable life. I think that's what I was aiming for. I wanted to find a nice Christian husband. I wanted to get a good job, probably one that helped other people, that would be good. I wanted to make a home. And I've been beginning to realise that I really don't need those things anymore, which is exciting. I have everything I need and so much more in Jesus. My identity is in Him, and I'm God's daughter. And I've been really challenged by the lives of Jesus and the other disciples. So they didn't have comfortable lives at all. And most of the time they didn't even have a home. And I'm beginning to see that if I really want to follow Jesus, my life probably won't be comfortable. And in particular, God's been convicting me of how materialistic my life is and how much it exploits other people. And that isn't right, not when the Bible's got so much to say about not exploiting the poor, about speaking up for the widow and the orphan and those who can't defend themselves. So God's definitely taking away my desire for a comfortable life. And He's really also showing me how appealing it is to serve and follow Him with my whole life. It's a bit scary, and I don't know how it's going to look yet, because it's very much in progress. God doesn't mean everything to me yet, but we're working on it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for being so honest, Abby, that was great. We're now going to have a chance to hear some of your questions and to give them an answer. So can I welcome Andy, Dave and MJ up to the stage. We've met Andy, but MJ and Dave, could you quickly introduce yourself?
I'm MJ, and at the moment I'm a full-time mum to Charlie, who's 5 months old.
I'm Dave, and I work for Emmanuel Church in Oxford, working with students.
Thanks, guys. Could we have the first question, please? Surely I don't need to see the world through Jesus' eyes in order to love poor people. Loads of people who aren't Christians give money to charity, etc., and they don't believe in immoral stuff like hell.
I think, first of all, I think Andy got us across as well that I don't think you have to be a Christian to do good things and in order to love poor people. I think sometimes, to our shame, other charities, other organisations do a better job than Christians in reaching out to the poorer people in need. And so, yeah, I wouldn't want to diss anything that any charity is doing for good in any way whatsoever. But I do think when you meet with Jesus Christ, your life can be radically changed. I can certainly say for myself that if my life hadn't been changed by Jesus, I definitely wouldn't be working for a church in Oxford. I'd probably be working for a big accountancy firm in London, as I nearly did. And I'd probably be trying to earn as much money as possible, and it would definitely be just for me. And that's speaking for me personally. I realise that other people would have been different. Yeah.
Thanks. Next question. If Christianity is all about loving the poor, why are they spending so much money on these talks?
Can I just say, I wish they were spending more money on these talks because I'm not getting paid. No. Josh, you're the president, what are you doing? Sorry. I think it's a good question. I think part of it is because ultimately for us, and you probably, if you've been to more than one meeting, you'll get the vibe that the heart of what we believe is that we've met Jesus, and the way one definition of evangelism, sharing the good news about Jesus that I've found helpful is just that it's one beggar telling another beggar where they found bread, and I think the CE just normal students who just want to do their best to share someone that they've discovered, and that's the priority. And then I suppose that what we believe is from that there'll be a whole army of us who go off to spend ourselves for the poor as a result of having seen them then. But if you want to tip them on my way out, then please do. That's a total joke. So.
Thank you. Next question. If Jesus sees the world with love and not hot blood of courage, why does the book of Revelation talk so much about Jesus and judgment and death?
Well, shall we go now? Yeah, there's a couple of questions about hell there, so that was the first one as well. It's a really good question, it's a really big one, and as I said the other day, sometimes with questions like this, it's not a great format, because you ask the question and then we give an answer and you can't come back at it. And I'm sure the answer, if I was to just sort of give the equivalent of a tweet for the answer to it, it wouldn't be satisfactory. But I think the big thing about judgment and hell, and the Bible does talk about it, is an understanding of what that means. And so for a Christian, to come to know God is our definition of heaven. So our understanding of heaven is eternal relationship with God. It's not so much the clouds and the harps and the angels and all that stuff you actually see all over here. It's not like hell, isn't it? But our understanding of heaven is eternal relationship with Him. And so when it's this question of hell, we can, if we mistake, and we think that's like devils poking in pitchforks and burning fire, I'm not sure that's what the Bible teaches heaven is. There's some strong imagery in Revelation, but Revelation is a particular type of literature. It reads a little bit like, I imagine, going into the two-parlour field. You've got incredibly strong images. But under the images, there's a message. And the message is, what hell is it's being outside of a relationship with God. And what we believe is that God doesn't force anyone into a relationship with him. And so we have the whole of our lives to say to him, okay, your will be done. And at the end of that, when we see him face to face, what he'll say to us is, okay, your will be done. And so if our will has been to be in his presence, then he'll say, okay, your will be done. And if our will has been, actually, I don't want to be near you, I don't want to have anything to do with you, then he says, okay, your will be done. And what happens is when he leaves us alone. And because we believe that everything good is God, our understanding of hell is that that's not a great situation. But it stems from this idea of he wants to give us a genuine choice, a real choice, as to whether or not to have a relationship with him. Because unless you get a real choice, it can never really be love. And he wants love in a relationship. So, but it's a really massive one. If you've got other questions about it, maybe come and grab me afterwards and we can talk about it a bit more.
Thank you. Next question. Wouldn't Jesus' teaching on poor be enough to reorient us? Why the cross and resurrection?
This is a really good question. In a way, I wish it was. I've got friends who love Jesus' teaching, but find it really hard to get to grips with the cross. Why did Jesus have to die? You know, if he did all those other miracles. And I think the real heart of it, what I found is that I've seen on the cross, I've seen Jesus' heart, that he so loves us that he has to do something totally radical in transforming us, in bringing us, as Andy said, from death to life. He who was totally alive became dead so that we who were spiritually dead could come alive when he was raised to life. And it's because we see the teaching on the poor and we want to do it, we want to, but you know, like you, Dave, I'm quite a selfish person, and I find it hard. You know, I might buy the big issue every so often, and I do give to charity, but actually my heart's not really changed. And I need someone who is not just a kind of a Mr. Motivator, but someone who's a heart surgeon who can actually change my heart and give me a new heart. And that's really what the cross is about giving us a new start, a new beginning, a new relationship with him. And it's made possible because he loves us and because he's died for us in our place.
Thanks, MJ. Next question. I agree that doing good works is great. Is this enough to get to heaven?
It's a great question. So I think we're all agreed that doing good works is great, and that's been clearly said by Andy, and I think I said that in the previous question as well. But I think the relationship between us and God, when we think of God as totally perfect in every way, for us to be restored into that relationship, it's going to take something bigger than us just doing a few good things, or even a lot of good things. And I think even more than that, people who go to heaven, as Andy's just been talking about in his previous answer to the question, is people who are choosing, we're understanding heaven as being the place where we're with God, and we're people who've chosen to want to be with God and the place where they will end up, then it's a bit different way of looking at it. So the people who are maybe not going to end up there are partly not ending up there because they haven't made that free choice that God's giving them. So it's a gift of God really to get to heaven, which he gives through Jesus Christ. And so Christian teaching would be that no, good works aren't enough to get us there, but we're not claiming in any way that we're doing anything special to get there. It's only through Jesus Christ.
Thanks. We've got time for one more question. Why are Christians forgiven people?
That's a good I think what I'm understanding by it is what makes it possible for them to be forgiven. I don't know if that's the gist of the question. And Andy mentioned that we're not perfect people, we're forgiven people. And that's one of the most liberating things I have to tell you about being a Christian. I find it just massively takes the pressure off to know that God, when he looks at us, when he looks at you and me, he doesn't see someone who's perfect at all, but someone who's broken and in need of his forgiveness, in need of his restoration, his wholeness, his healing. And the amazing thing I've found about Jesus Christ is he offers that in himself, in coming to know him, putting your trust in him. And then the most staggering thing is that then when you give your life to Jesus and you say yes to him, and he comes and moves into your life and he kind of makes his dwelling place in your life, that's kind of how the Bible speaks of it. God then sees you just as he sees Jesus, as a perfect person. And that's staggering, that's grace. Grace is just undeserved favour. It's just totally undeserved that God would see us like that when you put your trust in Jesus. It's totally free for us, but it was really costly for him, and it cost him his life. So that's, I think, what it means to be forgiven, to be bought, I guess, at a price at Jesus' death.
Thank you. Could we give the question panel a round of applause?